Thanks everyone for coming today. I'm going to talk about mortality and manure composting. I'm mostly going to spend time on the mortality side of things, and by mortality, we're talking about dead animals because that's just a part of raising livestock, right? We'd like it to be as small as possible, but there will be those death losses. And so it's a great practice, and I sort of wanted to do this to let everybody know that it's an encouraged practice. So if you haven't started composting, there's some good reasons to do that. I like to show this because George Washington was a big fan of composting. It says, "Let others rake and scrape up all the trash of every sort and kind about the houses, and in the holes and corners, and throw it all I mean that will make dung into the stirkerary." So this is a diagram that was drawn of his actual facility, which looks a lot like some of our covered livestock facilities today for composting. And so with composting, there are, oh my goodness, I don't know why it's doing that now, but with composting, there's sort of two goals, and they seem opposite, but they work together. So, in one hand, we want to produce a beneficial, environmentally sensitive or responsible product, and you could even sell it. Maybe not so much for mortality composting, but for certainly for anybody with manure compost, that's a pretty hot commodity. So, manure compost is a very popular thing for people to buy, and it's an alternative means of disposing of a waste product. So, again, in terms of a dead animal, there's other things you can do with that dead animal. Of course, rendering is a great option. Rendering being companies have the ability to take an animal and break it down into many parts and many products and ingredients that can be used in other things, and that's a great thing. But there will be those times when animals can't be rendered. So if something's been dead too long, and this is where I would initially start, is call up the rendering company and say, okay, so this is what I have, will you take it or not? And so if something's been dead too long, there could be a specific age of an animal that they may not want to take, or a species of an animal, and that really depends. You just have to call the rendering company and ask them. Um, Landfilling can be an option, but in that case, for a large livestock producer, that's probably not what you're going to do. And I should take a second and say here, when I think about composting, you can compost large quantities of animals, but then you have to have the space and the resources to do that. So when this sort of conversation started, I've been talking about composting dead animals for a long time, but decided to sort of talk about it a little more because um, there may be times where having the ability to compost daily dead animals. So if you're a large operation, having the ability to compost your daily sort of death loss, there might be a period of time even where that might be more desirable. Maybe there would be, we'd sort of discuss this with the Kansas Department of Agriculture and said, what if there was a time when rendering trucks were not allowed to move around the state? If there was some kind of stop order where animals could not be moved around the state while an outbreak was happening of a certain disease somewhere. And so having it as an option, even if you do have rendering services available, it is kind of nice. And again, like I said, there could be animals that have been dead too long, and so they're but I do support rendering. Rendering is a great option. It's a great first option because you can reuse, like I said, reuse the parts of an animal, whether that's hide or hooves or whatever it is, blood. Those can all be used as ingredients in many things, and so that's a great option. But sometimes it's not an option. Burial can be an option. Um, that, in fact, many of you that are listening probably know that confined animal feeding operations in my state, Kansas, where I am, the confined animal feeding operations have predetermined burial sites for if they did have to put down a whole herd or something. So their burial can be an option. Of course, burial of like daily death losses that'll start to take up space, obviously. And animals that are buried, they're going to actually be there for a long time in the ground. Yes, they do decompose, but it does take a very long time. And if that space is ever wanted for another purpose, such as building, that might be unpleasant to dig back into. So, why compost? It does reduce the volume and the mass of the the items that you're composting. So especially I think about this for manure composting. if the um, nutrient management plans that confined animal feeding operations have. Of course, they work with probably consultants to monitor the nutrient levels in soil. And so if the nutrient levels became so high, specifically phosphorus became so high in an area, it can be beneficial to compost manure so that you can haul it farther away from a location and have less mass. Again, if it's a marketable so again, that can improve the handling and the storage and the transportation. In manure, you're going to have, if you tested manure, you'll know that you can look at the total nitrogen content, for example, but the ammonium and the nitrate, the plant usable forms, in compost or in manure, those change form over time when composted. So, oh, okay, I have a request to increase my volume. Let's see. Would that just be my volume speaking? I guess I'll just talk louder, drive all my neighbors in the office crazy. So let's see what. There we go. Okay, so I'll just speak louder. So if when composted manure, when nitrogen in composting takes it from a form that can be lost. So ammonia that's in nitrogen or in manure can be lost, but if you take it and compost it, it does reduce the amount of nitrogen that's in manure, but it puts it into a slowly available form, the organic form. You can produce a useful product, right? So it can be land applied, can be hauled farther. You can reduce odors with composting. Composting does reduce odors. You can reduce pathogens and flies. Weed seed can be killed. I'll come back to that later with, not specifically with manure or mortalities. Are you going to reduce, I guess, landfill space use? Sometimes some can be landfilled, but composting for some people just makes them feel good, that you're keeping something out of a landfill or reusing something. Especially, I think, with composting certain animals, like a pleasure animal, like a horse. You can bury a horse, but I mean, of course, companion animal, long-term companion animal, but you could compost that horse also and then reuse the compost somewhere to plant, perhaps in landscaping to, uh, you know, to remember that animal. Amber, did you just come on? I just heard a noise. Okay. So composting is the controlled biological decomposition of organic materials, primarily by the action of microorganisms, and to a lesser extent, worms and insects. I'm not talking about vermicomposting today. Vermicomposting is a completely separate type of composting. It's really probably best called worm farming, but that's a completely different way of composting. But controlled is the operational word there has to be controlled. Um, Otherwise, we can get into real problems. So composting is done under aerobic conditions, meaning with oxygen. So oxygen has to be able to get into the pile. Anaerobic is without oxygen, but compost piles can go anaerobic at least part of the time, or part of the core of a pile might be anaerobic. So a diagram of that is here. So with the oxygen diffusing into the pile, oxygen, in our environment is 20-something%, right? So oxygen is always going to diffuse into the pile, and then heat and water and carbon dioxide are what's given off by that pile. And so what's in there, inside that pile, we have to have organic material. There's going to be minerals. So if you think from an animal, there's going to be bones, but from any other item too. Minerals, nutrients, water is an important ingredient, and I'll get there, and organisms. So aerobic organisms, just like us, require oxygen, and so getting oxygen into a pile is important. So the major factors are oxygen, nutrients, water, temperature, and time. So with nutrients, ideally what we want to have is a carbon to nitrogen ratio. This is in sort of normal composting. So this would apply to manure composting as well, but not so much mortality composting. The ideal carbon to nitrogen is 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, and a range of 20 parts to 40 parts is totally fine. So if you look there, manure is 15 to 20 parts carbon and nitrogen, yard waste and that could vary. So it says 20 there, that could be more like grass clippings, and leaves might be more around 80 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And wood chips can be really, really high, of course. And so you may need to mix several materials to get towards a correct carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you are trying to uh, compost wood chips, they could be there for a very long time. But I visited a facility where they're going to start composting. In fact, what it is the wood chips out of trucks when feeder pigs are transported. So just the baby pigs, small pigs, I should say, feeder pigs are transported. It's just wood chips, and then there's baby, small pig, 30-pound pig or so, urine and manure that's in there. And so what comes out of that truck is actually, I was concerned that it may not have enough nitrogen, and the person would have to figure out where they're going to get the high nitrogen material to make this compost. And I was actually surprised. I was wrong. There was more nitrogen that those pigs were contributing to those wood chips, and it ended up being pretty perfect. So, we figured that out because it was cooking along. So temperature. So here are some high nitrogen materials, and there are a lot of books. There's a lot of resources that you can find, online resources to find some of these ratios. If in doubt, if you ever wanted to know the carbon to nitrogen ratio of a particular material, that can be submitted to any testing lab, soil testing lab, plant testing lab, and they would just incinerate that, and they can measure the carbon and nitrogen and tell you the amount. So, but I will say that there are resources online if you want to know the carbon to nitrogen ratio of a lot of different strange things. There are a lot of people that have determined those over time. So maybe don't need to spend the money, but sure, certainly can if it's a specialty item. So for temperature, this optimum range is 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And to kill weed seeds, a weed seed basically needs to be experience 145 degree Fahrenheit temperature for about a day. And so when that says 1 day 5 turns, that just means if you think about it, a weed seed needs to be on the inside of the pile at that hot temperature. And so we encourage, for killing weed seeds, you'll want to turn a pile maybe 3 to 5 times to make sure that the weed seeds can all get mixed into that pile and be on the inside and sterilized at some point. Now, pathogens, and that's probably something a lot of people are thinking about, pathogens there's a lot of different pathogens, right? So for pathogens, generally speaking, 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days is a pretty good temperature to kill most pathogens. But you see here it says at 150 degrees above that for any length of time can actually cause the microorganisms inside the pile to get too hot, and you could end up with your pile essentially getting really, really hot and then potentially getting really, really cold as all the microbes are dying inside the pile. So temperature monitoring is really important, and I've got slides on that. And here's, you can see the site that I have. This is actually here on campus. We compost several different materials here at Kansas State. Manure is one of them. That's done at our animal science units. And then at the agronomy units, we are on the agronomy farm by the stadium, we compost several different items. And this is just showing that 2 different piles. One is our mature compost and the other is immature compost, and it's melting same day, same everything, but the light is really different, or I'm sorry, the heat is different, completely different. So do compost piles stay active in the wintertime? Certainly they do. They're quite insulated. It was the inside of the pile where the composting is happening. Not much is happening on the outside, but eventually when it warms again and that material is turned into the inside, I would think of it as stirring, flipping it from what was on the outside ends up on the inside, and it will break down. So here it says the thermometer is the most basic necessary tool in composting. So a long-stemmed thermometer is good. A 3 foot, 4 foot, depending how big you want to make your piles. It might vary on what your temperature, what your thermometer is. And I will say for anyone listening in Kansas that you're like, if you'd like a site visit, I'm happy to come work with you on your farm to come visit. So, because this is almost like going vehicle shopping, right? In terms of me saying, oh, everybody needs to do this or that. That's almost like saying everybody needs to drive a pickup or everybody needs to drive a car. And when really this is a highly specialized decision, I think, for for where you're going to compost, what you're going to compost, and maybe some of these tools even. But I will say a very basic tool in composting is this thermometer. And so you'll want something, that dial on that little graphic only goes to 180. You would probably want something that has a dial of up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, because if you're getting anything above 150 some degrees, you need to know about it. So a dial that goes, 0 to 200 would be a good range. So you can probably just search for those on the internet. I don't have a specific brand in mind, but and that slide says there's more sophisticated types. There are types that can, send you the information wirelessly to your phone. So it's whatever you want to do, whatever thermometer you want to get, whatever your needs are. So I say mortality composting can be a nice alternative. Again, I talked about rendering as being a great alternative as well. There might even be just times of year. So if normally you would bury an animal, but in the wintertime, and if it's been a really, really cold winter, you may not have burial as a great option, but you could certainly start a composting pile for that animal. So uh, I just consider it a nice alternative. So now I'm going to get into sort of specifics on mortality composting, and these are some old pictures that I have. I've got a newer one from a demonstration actually that we're working on right now, but they can look a lot of different ways. But when you're talking about mortality composting, it's perhaps best described as an above ground burial in a biofilter. So biofilter, people often ask me, what about the smell? Can you smell it? And the answer is not really. You would be surprised. That high carbon material. So when you're turning a compost pile, so when I turn my compost piles, there is a poof of smell that comes out of it right when you turn it. And so what just the sulfur bearing compounds, nitrogen compounds, really it's an ammonia smell. Really a poof will kind of come out, and then very quickly the microorganisms then start to work again, and there's really not a lot of scent, not a lot of smell coming out of the compost pile. It's less than you would think it would be. So a biofilter, that's what that's sort of referring to. It's filtering that smell as the microorganisms are really working on it. So sort of a how-to, and there's ranges here, but 18 to 24 inches of a high carbon material. So back on the slide that I had that had the lists of different materials, by high carbon material, that could be a lot of different things. Corn stalks would be a great one. Wheat straw, that can be a good one, although it's kind of a little bit fine particle size. You want to have some structure to a pile so that oxygen can sort of continue getting in. You wouldn't want to do this with sawdust probably because it's got a fine particle size, but if you had bigger wood chips that you could mix in, so there's a lot of options. There are people that I work with that all they compost in, they'll just use manure. So they will take manure and that's all they compost with. So they take when I say high carbon material, you'd want that to be again a compost or a material that has quite a bit of carbon in it. We wouldn't want a really low carbon material. So for manure, you might need to find manure that has more carbon in it. Or you could mix that with corn stalks. Again, that's one of those sort of things, figuring out what you have. I wouldn't buy anything, but figuring out what you have that you can work with. But so chunky manure can be a really, really good option. So 18 to 24 inches of that material laid down in a bed, and then you place an animal, whatever animal it is. And then you sort of can think of geometry here. If you had one large cow or one large steer, but if you had like 3 smaller, like 400, 500-pound animals die in a day, you can kind of place those together in a bed. So it's sort of, it can vary quite a bit. The one kind of gross part here is lancing the rumen or the stomach is really, really important. And that's because you place an animal in the pile and it will bloat. And the important thing, the reason you want to do this is because as that animal would bloat, the high carbon material that you're about to place on top of it could eventually slide off. And you don't want this to be exposed. The idea is that you're going to basically entomb an animal in carbon, and you don't ever want that to be exposed. So lancing the rumen or stomach is really important. And even though it's gross, you want to do it. And then you want to water thoroughly. So placing the animal and then giving a good thorough watering is important to get the water in contact right there. You don't want to just water later on. You want to water at the time that you put it down as much as you can possibly do that. And then you'll just bury it again with 18 to 24 inches of high carbon material in every direction. So again, sort of thinking of it as almost like snow globe shaped is what it could look like, or it could look like in a long windrow if you have multiple animals. And that's it for that day. And then you want to monitor the temperature. So again, with that long stemmed thermometer, come back, make sure it heats up in a few days. I'm sure it will, but make sure it heats up. And then watch what the temperature does. So you want to water as needed. So when you're like, how do you know? Well, when the temperature drops, it's probably in an arid state like ours, fairly dry state like Kansas, especially as you go west, it's probably going to be short on water. So if you water it and the temperature comes back up, then you know you've done the right thing. And so you want to turn this after 6 months. In other words, I would not go digging into this any time between day 1 and 6 months. I would leave it alone. Now, if you're composting a few chickens, they'll go a lot faster. But if you're composting a 1,000-pound or larger animal, I would let that dictate how soon you go digging into this. I wouldn't dig into it very soon if it was a large cow or larger animal. I would just leave it alone. And that's really different than sort of normal composting. So if we're talking about manure composting, you'd want to turn that whenever the temperature drops. Whenever the temperature does so it'll spike after you turn it and water it, and then it'll drop off. You don't want to just sit there and let it, sit there at 80 to 100 degrees forever. You want to turn it and then water it. Water while you turn would be great. And then, so use the temperature as your guide. So how do you know when it's done? When it doesn't reheat again after turning and watering. So again, with the mortality composting being slightly different, a little bit more like crock pot cooking, I would leave it alone for 6 months. Again, smaller animals can go a little faster, but 6 months is a good rule of thumb. And so what do you find after 6 months? Well, and here's another diagram, and I will say that a lot of great resources are on the Cornell University's Waste Management Institute. They have a website that's got wonderful materials, and I've stolen this diagram from them. They have videos on natural rendering, mortality composting. They have resources galore, and so it is really a great site for all kinds of materials. It's where I go. So again, this is sort of showing if you had a calf or several smaller animals, you can sort of do this sort of arrangement where you would place them in, and you're not trying to lay a whole bunch of animals on top of each other without trying to put some high carbon material in there to space them out. And so this might be the same for swine. This is a cow. This is this person here that's watering it. He's a faculty member in soils at Fort Hays State University. So Fort Hays State University in western Kansas is actually, they're teaching animal composting as an option in their courses. And so we had a workshop and they were kind enough to host us. So Dr. Brittany Howell is not in this picture. That's Amara Bandari, but Brittany Howell is out of the picture. And she is doing a wonderful job as well. So Brittany is a faculty member in animal science. And so this was an animal that had to be put down. This was a cow. It had to be put down because it had cancer. And my understanding is that the animal could not go into the food supply because it had cancer. It had been under treatment, but they were not able to cure it. So this animal was euthanized and placed here in this pile. And so we did lance the rumen. The rumen's already been lanced, and we've put down possibly a little bit higher than even needed, but it's probably possibly a little bit higher than 24 inches. Here, we're doing this on a concrete pad only because we had it available. It doesn't have to occur on a compost on a concrete pad. And so here, we're watering it, again, literally spraying it down with water that day. You could, you don't want to overwater, but definitely adding water. And of course, you're like, well, that animal's full of water. It is, but the evaporation that happens from a compost pile is pretty impressive over time. So we do need to add water to make sure we've got plenty to start the composting process. Monitoring temperature, again, can be really, really important. It's when actively composting, we could be, this is what, a little under 130. This is not that particular animal, but this is manure composting. That's important, so important. So if it heats up and then it cools down, that's your pile telling you something. And usually, again, that means if it's manure composting, I would water it and turn it. If it's mortality composting and it cools off, I would just water it. Now, again, after 6 months of doing this, the temperature is probably not going to heat up again upon uh, uh, watering it. So where can you compost? So this is a producer from he's actually in the Hayes area. We visited him, his farm. He was kind enough to let us come out when we were there for that workshop. And so he is, this composting, he's standing there, right? Those piles are where he is composting dead animals right now. And right there is his feedlot. So that's probably a big question that you have. Where can you compost? And this depends. So if you are a confined animal feeding operation where you already have basins where all your drainage water has to go, then you're already pretty well set up for finding a place to compost on your grounds, as long as it's going to be in the footprint of that area where the water drains. And so that would be an important thing to work on with your inspectors from Department of Livestock, or sorry, Department of Agriculture. You already have livestock inspectors working with them. So it's really great that in Kansas, our Department of Health and Environment, which Bureau of Waste Management under the Department of Health and Environment, they regulate composting of basically most other things. And then Department of Ag, which manages the inspection of confined animal feeding operations, they work very well together. All the staff work together. They know, okay, and they all encourage animal composting as an option if somebody wants to do it. And so it's just a matter of doing it in the right place so as not to cause any environmental problems. So again, here right next to his pens, and when asking, why he was so interested in animal composting, well, one of the reasons is because frankly, the rendering trucks won't come to his area. He said he was in a bit of a dead spot, if you will, for rendering truck routes. He was out a little too far, and I don't know that their operation, was how often they had death losses. So for them, it was convenience, but well, because they didn't have to haul their dead animals anywhere. They could also just place it right here. They had the manure from the pens that they could access, scrape that and put it there. In fact, you can stack that and stockpile it for when you do have dead animals. And one of the people, somebody asked, well, what about burial? And they were just like, burial is frankly a pain to go get an excavator, bury the animal. And so in their view, this was just an easier way to dispose of the animals and the manure. And they don't compost all of their manure. They directly land apply most of their manure, but they do here use it in their composting. So again, I stole this from the Cornell Waste Management Institute. And sort of if you think about composting, where you don't want to do it, in this case, this would be a natural body of water, how far from a pond, how far from a river, how far from a well. Those are all important considerations so that we don't lose a bunch of nutrients into water sources, obviously. Property lines would be another one. So just sort of, again, if you are a confined animal feeding operation, you're going to have perfect footprint upon which to find a place on your property where that any runoff water would go. And for the occasional burial on other, like if you're just a small producer with occasional burial, or like pleasure animals for people on acreages, there could be there are the rules are slightly different. Let's put it that way. In terms of you still have to adhere to all of the same things with setbacks from water, but there aren't rules for a settling basin, for example, if that makes sense. So the Department of Health and Environment, Bureau of Solid Waste, they encourage composting to save landfill space. Kansas Department of Agriculture, they encourage composting as part of a biosecurity plan. I gave that example earlier. If there was some kind of stop animal move order that happened, this would be a great short-term option for people, large feeding operations with their daily deaths or their occasional deaths that they have during this time. If they can't go render it, and if they can't bury it again, if it was February and the ground was really frozen or something, so they both of these entities encourage composting as part of a plan. You have to have a plan where you're going to do this. And for help with your particular site or location, I think it's best to work with your inspector for your confined animal feeding operation. And if you have questions about, oh, okay, do I fall under this the smaller amount, I think you should contact your local extension office. There's many of our extension agents who are very knowledgeable about it, and livestock and livestock production. They are very knowledgeable on this as well. And if they don't have that particular experience yet, they can contact me too, and I can hook them up. So uh, I'm happy to do that. So again, this is sort of redundant there. If you have specific questions, I'm happy to take those. That's my email address, so I'll leave that up for a second. So it's just my first name, Deanne, at ksu.edu.